Mr. Crosby here, and I'm going to be taking you through the first real passage you get to translate in the thrilling book, So You Really Want to Learn Latin. I'm sure you're loving it already. Okay, this in my book is exercise 4.12. It's on page 43. Hopefully yours is the same. And we're going to firstly break down, try and come up with some useful tips that's going to help us and stand us in good stead all the way through our lifetime of translating Latin. We need to develop some rules here. So, off we go. The first thing I'm going to notice is the verbs. We've got some verbs here straight up, and I can see here I've got two tenses. I've got a bat in perfect ending. I've got an errant, a perfect ending. Okay. In fact, those are the only two tenses in this passage because it's telling a story about the past. So we're not going to get any present or future verbs in this case. However, we are also going to get some nouns. Okay, in the first two declensions. I can see here an a and an am ending in the first declension. Okay, nouns like puella, all going like that. And I can also see I've got some second declension endings, bellow, okay, nouns, masculine nouns like servus and neuter nouns like bellow itself are going to be popping up as well. And finally, I can see there's a lot of prepositional phrases come in colis there, okay. So we're going to be dealing with prepositions plus the nouns that follow them, and the cases that the prepositions take are really important. Now let's get started annotating this passage and breaking it down into manageable chunks. And I recommend, in fact most people will, you start with the verbs in Latin because they're going to dictate the rest of either the sentence or part of the sentence, the clause. First off we've got narabant. We've got narabat, pugnarbant, delawerunt, timebant, vulnerabant. Okay, and I notice straight away here that I'm dealing with third person endings, singular and plural. Okay, and that's what we'd expect when you're telling a story about the past. However, when we get into some speech here, I've also got some first person. It's really important to notice the difference because that's going to dictate what type of subject we're going to be looking for in the sentence. So we've got habitabam, a first person singular imperfect ending. Another one, pugnarbam, habebam, and another pugnarbam. And immediately I'm starting to think, okay, the person speaking is going to be the subject of the sentence. And without an ego, I'm not going to be looking for any nouns to fill in that. And then I've got it shifting up into a different tense, but the same. Kalawi is that first person plural ending. Okay. Then the passage is going back to the third person. Timebant, superawerunt, delawerunt. Okay, sedebant. Okay, and then another shift back to the first person. Sedebam. Okay, vulnerawi and superawi, all first person singular. And then finally, we go out of the speech and we get to the end of the passage with narawit and amarwerunt there, third person out of speech. Now that I've done this, I need to start thinking about the subject in the clause or sentence. So it's really key that I focus on the verb ending. What person, and is it singular or plural? Here we've got a bat ending, and that's telling me that it's third person singular. So I'm looking for a singular noun in the nominative case. Okay, and I've got two nouns before it. I've got agricola and I've got fabulam. Okay, and I know that am is only an accusative ending. The a can be a number of things, but in this case, because I'm looking for a nominative, I'm gonna go with agricola being the subject. Okay, I'm then going to look at my next verb, and I can see that the slight difference here is we've got a bant ending, so we're still third person. We're still looking for a noun to fill in this to fit the subject of the sentence. However, because it's a plural ending, I'm looking for a plural noun in the nominative. Okay, and here we get a bit of a tricky one here. So we've got incolai and we've got graikii here. Okay, and here this is two endings that are both looking like they could be nominative. Remember, puella in the nominative plural would be puellai. So two endings here that we've got to choose between. Okay, or could it be both? Well, I'm also going to notice that, okay, these are two separate nouns, and I've got this were fighting sense. Okay, now here, this noun here means Greece. Okay, I can't really make that into a plural. Okay, so that doesn't really fit. So the incolai, the inhabitants, okay, we can have more than one inhabitant, so that's likely to fit the bill. However, I'm also going to want to think about the fact that the I ending could also be a genitive. So the inhabitants of Greece makes much more sense. Okay, so there's a little element of common sense here before I start translating, and so I've got to work that out using a little bit of logic. And obviously I could use the same argument to rule out Troii, the city of Troy there. That's not going to make much sense either. So I'm just going to go through the first paragraph and underline in a different colour all the subjects that I can spot out. So we've already decided on Agricola and Incolai as subjects. Okay. In my next one, I can see delere werunt. I don't have any nominative nouns. So what I'm going to assume is, in that case, like in English, you can then supply they, and that's going to be referring back to the incolai, the previous subject. Okay. In the next sentence, I've got that incolai again, nominative plural ending. Okay. And then in the final clause after the said, okay, this little word that's separating the clauses out. I don't have any more nominatives, so I do the same trick and assume that the incolai are still the subjects of vulnerabant, and I'm going to translate it as they. Now, like I said earlier, these first person endings are not likely going to have a nominative subject. We don't have the word ego, we don't have a word for I in there, so we're not really looking for a subject. But it is just worth reminding ourselves to be sensible. Check the verb endings first, because you might get some words like multa, tela, and you see the a ending, and you think, well, this could be the subject. But obviously, we're not looking for a singular noun, and so we must be looking for a different explanation for this later on, and we'll come back to that. Okay, so once I've gone through all the first persons, I'm back to the third person with timebant. Okay, and surprise, surprise, the incolai are the subject once more. Okay. In the next sentence, I've still got that plural third person ending and incolai again, dead easy. Okay, and then the next verb again, all we've got with delere werunt is the teram. That's not going to be a nominative ending, so it must be the incolai still doing that. We'll translate that as they again. Okay. Sede bant is going to take incolai. Okay, this is making our life really easy at the moment. Okay, and then I can see the today bound back to the first person. So there's and Woolnarawi also first person, and Superawi first person. So 3 first persons there, requiring no subjects to be supplied. Okay. Finally, okay, we've got right back to the beginning, how we started the tale. We've got the Agricola. Okay, he's still telling the story, so he's going to be the subject, and we've got Incolai here as a subject with a malwerunt. Okay, so this is actually, other than supplying I and they, we've only got 2 nouns, 1 singular, 1 plural, that are doing all of the verbs. So now let's start translating our first sentence. Agricola fabulam narabat. So I've got my subject, the farmer. Okay, I can see it's an imperfect ending, so it's a was telling. Okay, there we go. I'll stick that down there so we can see. Now I'm looking for an accusative. I need some sort of object. What is he telling? Well, I've got fabulam, tale there, with an accusative ending. It fits the bill. Easy peasy. Okay, so the farmer was telling a tale. In fact, let's have a story. So, the farmer starts his story by saying the inhabitants pugnarbant, the inhabitants were fighting. So I'll add that first. Okay. So, speech, the inhabitants were fighting. Okay. So, the inhabitants of Greece were fighting. Now, I'm usually going to be looking for an object in the accusative here. So something like the inhabitants were fighting a war or something like that. So that's what I'm looking for. However, instead I've got this cum inculas Troiai. Okay, I've got a preposition here, which means rather than having a direct object, I've got an indirect object, and cum means with in this case. I also know, because I've done my revision and learned everything properly, that cum takes the ablative. Okay, and I've got this ease ending there, an ablative ending. That really fits that bill. So, with the inhabitants there. However, Troiai is not an ablative ending, and so it makes sense to compare Troiai with Graikei. They're both doing the same thing for different inhabitants. Okay, so again, we want a genitive sense for Troiai. So that leaves us with the inhabitants of Greece were fighting with, that's the cum, the inhabitants, okay, of Troy. There we go. And let's stick that down there. In my next sentence, I can see we've got another plural verb here, but the only noun at all I've got is Troiam, and that's an accusative ending. So that means I've got to, for the first time in the passage, supply a they. Okay, and just like in English, we're going to understand that that's continuing talking about the previous subject, the inhabitants. Okay, so just like in English, it's going to go something like, they did not destroy. Help if I could spell Troy. Okay, and I've got in there my my perfect tense as well. Okay, did not destroy. Alright, and I'll just move that there. In my final sentence, I can see that things are a little bit more complicated because I've got 2 verbs in a single sentence. Okay, but the key word separating them, that conjunction there, is said. Okay, but. So I'm effectively going to take everything up to the said first and then do everything after the said afterwards. Okay. I can also see I've got that et there as another conjunction. That's not actually separating clauses because I've got two is endings, okay, two ablative plural endings, well three if we include the adjective multis there. So three ablative endings, and what that's doing is just separating those two. So I'll start with my subject again, the inhabitants of Troy. This time I'm doing the verb, okay, and we've got an imperfect, okay, so the inhabitants of Troy were afraid of, and then I can see that I've got this accusative plural incolas, so that's going to be the people that they are afraid of, and the incolas, we've got the graikei again, genitive. So the inhabitants of Troy were afraid of the inhabitants of Greece. So, but they, i.e. the inhabitants, were wounding, with my imperfect verb. I then need to look for an accusative, and I've got that incolas, and the genitive that we're now getting used to in this passage, the inhabitants of Greece. There we go. Okay. Now I've finally got to look at these endings, these is endings here. Okay, and that is either a dative or an ablative plural ending. I've got to figure out which is which. So I could just go through the different possibilities, translate datives and ablatives until I get one that makes sense. Okay, and if I was to do that, I would settle on probably the sense of with. Okay, not with a preposition this time, but with many arrows. And of course spears, presumably in this case the javelins they would throw from the walls because they're hiding behind their walled city. So that's with many arrows and spears. And we'll stick that one down here as well. Okay, what I want you to do now is pause this video and pair up with somebody, and I want you to go through this first paragraph and see how well you've done. If you've made any mistakes, I want you to work in pairs to help each of you develop targets. Have you been translating the verbs accurately? Has the imperfect tense been translated as a was, were, ing? Has the imperfect tense been translated as an ed for now? Okay, destroyed with the ed at the end. Okay, have you been noticing that these verbs are singular and plural, and therefore that's the type of nominative noun that we're looking for? Okay, has that caused any mistakes? Have you noticed the genitives and coped with them okay, or have they thrown you a little bit? And finally, have you been able to tackle it when the ablative has come up, either with a preposition, okay, or just on its own? Okay, so pause now, come up with some targets, and then you can get on with the rest of the video. Okay, we're now going to go through the rest of the passage at a much faster speed, okay? But let's just remember that we're dealing with first-person singular endings, okay, in the imperfect, but we're going to supply a subject, I. So, we're starting with I was living, with that imperfect taken into account. And then noticing that I've got another prepositional phrase prope Troia. Prope means near, and it takes the accusative, so we've got that am ending, near Troy. Okay, and then our next verb, again we've got that bam ending, okay, another I subject, but this time, just like in English, I'm not actually going to include the I. And that's because I've got this et conjunction that tells me that the clauses are related anyway. So it's going to go, and was fighting, okay, in bellow, in the war, another prepositional phrase. Okay, let's stick this down here, there we go. I could even get rid of the was, okay, I was living near Troy and fighting in the war. That makes perfect sense, and it's a little bit more succinct. Now, because we're on the next sentence, the bam this time is going to have an I supplied again, okay? But let's think about this. We've got a neuter plural accusative there, okay? Obviously, we might be mistaken in thinking that it was a nominative initially if we hadn't paid attention to the fact that it's first person, and therefore that's not possible. So I'm going to write I had, oh, I don't want red, sorry. I had many weapons, rather than was having sounds a little bit odd. So I had many weapons is a better translation in this case. And was fighting in a fight. So I've gone back to a was-ing version of the imperfect here, and I've noticed the prepositional phrase taken the ablative in pugnis. I could have translated that in a battle as well, okay, but I want to distinguish in this case between certain words. The next sentence is introduced by a but, okay, so said but, and then we've got a perfect tense here. So, but I hid, and then we're looking for our accusative, the arrows, and then our prepositional phrase, sub mensa, under a table. So, but I hid the arrows under a table. Stick that down there again. Back in the third person, so the inhabitants of Greece again were afraid of the arrows. Then we've got the inhabitants of Greece becoming the subjects. Okay, and they are in perfect tense. They overcame. Okay, the farmers of Troy. And probably by now you're getting the sense that the book has only introduced you to limited vocab. Okay, oh, I've misspelled inhabitants there. Double S. Get rid of that one. Okay, yeah, you're starting to see how the passage is having to use a very limited vocabulary in the way it works. But you'll notice that we've got a new accusative here, okay, agrikolas, so we've got a different subject introduced, that accusative plural ending, and again, Troii, a genitive. Now the et lets me know that we've got another clause coming up, and like earlier on in the passage, the third person plural ending that is repeated twice means that I don't even need to supply the they in the second clause, just like in English. So, all we need to do is add and destroyed the land. Okay, now this is obviously referring to the Greeks having besieged Troy and now struggling to get into the city. So rather than do that, they've attacked the farmers around the city and burnt all the crops and that sort of thing. The next sentence starts with a prepositional phrase, post Victoriam. Again, post taking the accusative, so we've got after the victory. After the victory, okay, we've got, again, we're back to the subject being the inhabitants of Greece, so the inhabitants of Greece, okay, imperfect were sitting, and then we've got that prepositional phrase, near a table. Okay, so stick that one down there. And just notice, again, another prepositional phrase, prope mensam. This passage, absolutely excellent for practicing all the different prepositions and making sure we recognise the case they take. Again, and we've got another accusative ending. And if that wasn't enough prepositions for you, then the next sentence is jam-packed full. So, sub mensa, under the table. Sub takes the ablative there. We've got an ablative A. And cum sagitis, okay, also taking the ablative with the arrows. Notice that I don't have either a subject because I've got this ending, this bam ending, but also I don't have an object either, not a direct object. I don't have any accusatives. I do have these indirect objects from the prepositions. So, I was sitting, imperfect there, under the table with the arrows. And there's really no limit to the amount of prepositional phrases we can have here, so we're not worried about that too much. Then we're going to I wounded Walnut Rawi, the inhabitants. Okay. And then this next clause is a little bit more tricky. Again, introduced by that et. Okay. And I've got, I know that I'm the subject, so I'm just looking for an object. A quick scan here tells me that the incolas again are the object. So I've just got to think very carefully about what to do with this. Okay. Again, we can see how lack of vocabulary at this stage is meaning that we're only really dealing with some very strange and slightly difficult ideas. Okay, so I've got to think about auxilio and sagittarum. Okay, auxilio here is an ablative, and so that means the help, and I want to be translating that with the help in this case, and then with the help belongs to the arrows, a plural genitive, the help of the arrows. So it's going, and I wounded the inhabitants with the help of the arrows. There we go. Finally, we're back out of speech and back to addressing the farmer as himself rather than him speaking. Okay, and he's back to telling the story. So, the farmer told the story to the many inhabitants of Rome. Okay, and I just want to point out that here we've got multis incolis. Actually, we've got a dative here for the first time. So, a dative 2 or 4, translated it here as 2. And obviously, Romi here being a genitive. And we're familiar with those now. And then our final sentence, the inhabitants did not love the story. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the passage. Okay, what I want you to do is go through that, pause the video now or stop the video and check, see how you've done, and with your partner come up with some tips for translating next time that you want to take into account. Okay, think about, have you translated these imperfect and perfect endings accurately? Okay, have you taken into account the case? Have you paid very close attention to the person of the verb? Are you aware that with this bam we're not really looking for a subject, or that we're looking for a plural nominative if we see errant, and if we don't have one, then we need to either supply a they, or in the case of the et clause, okay, just continue the action like we do in English. Okay, have you paid very close attention to the nominative endings and the accusative endings as well, making sure that we're aware that the nominative will always be doing the verb, and have we checked that we are correct by going back and seeing if the verb is plural or singular and matching that, making sure that we're looking at a nominative plural ending if we've got that plural verb. Finally, last target you might want to have is, have you taken into account the prepositional phrases that we've got throughout the passage? Are we able to translate them? Can we recognize the case that each one takes? Okay, are they taking the ablative like the sub mensa? Okay, or might they be taking the accusative instead, like post victoriam? Okay, all right. So set yourself some targets, and there we go.